hate to follow that up with some ground surveys, but we're gonna try to make it sound cool. All right, hi everyone. My name is Jordan and I've been with the Kennedy Center for about 2.5 years, and I am currently wrapping up my thesis. And with that, I have lots of results, but I'll try to keep it short for today's purpose. And my overall thesis is titled Avian Temporal Trends and Habitat Relations within the South Atlantic Coastal Zone. So this is my third advisory council meeting, so I won't go too far into detail as far as intro to my project goes, but the South Atlantic coastal plain of South Carolina is an important region for migrating, wintering, and breeding waterfowl and other water birds because it provides a stopover site for migrating birds, provides a food source, and provides a nesting site for breeding birds and many other characteristics. Our study is going to focus on 7 main wetland types in South Carolina, as according to NWI, including deep water wetlands, estuarine wetlands, freshwater emergent, freshwater forested and shrub, freshwater ponds, riverine, and lakes. And although this region contains 27% of the wetlands within the lower 48 states, only about 9% of these are of high or moderate value to waterfowl. And as more and more of the coast is being developed, it's also important to note the wetlands within these developed areas. So urban wetlands are extensively altered natural systems that include pools, lakes, and ponds used as water supply reservoirs, flood control, and waterfowl and other water birds will use these environments as an attractive food source and where they might be fed regularly by human residents. And this use by water birds could alter their populations and distributions, leading to changes in their habitat use and selection. And one of the big factors that attract birds to these wetlands is their food supply. So macroinvertebrates are small bug-like organisms present within the substrate of lakes, ponds, and streams, and belonging to several categories such as sponges, worms, insects, and mollusks. And not only are they a great source of protein to water birds and other wetland-dependent species, but they contribute to other wetland functions such as litter decomposition, nutrient cycling, and plant community regulation. And historically, 30 to 50% of the Atlantic flyways, green-winged teal, northern shovelers, mallards, pintail, widgeon, and gadwall wintered in the region. Unfortunately, recent evidence suggests a trend towards waterfowl wintering further north, conceivably due to climate change and warming temperatures. So this brings me to my study's objectives. So despite the importance of the Hobcaw Barony and the establishment of the James C. Kennedy Waterfowl and Wetlands Conservation Center, no comprehensive study of water birds has occurred on this site. Therefore, basic information such as number of species present, relative abundance, migration chronology, and habitat use are all fundamental to proper management, and they are lacking. So we're aiming to form a sort of baseline of wetland conditions that include, but are not limited to, all of those factors I just mentioned as a beginning to a long-term data set. So my thesis will have 2 main chapters. The first being, first specific objectives were to document winter and spring temporal trends and spring migration chronology of water birds using wetlands on the Hobcaw Barony and Devereux Colony, and to determine which species have similar migration patterns. And my second chapter, specific objectives, would be in determining what environmental factor or factors are attracting water birds to this area, specifically for each species and each species guild as a whole. So my study took place here at Hobcaw and at the Devereux Colony. And Hobcaw, that large area on the bottom, is around 16,000 acres, with around 50% of those acres being wetlands. And Devereux, our neighboring property right above, is about 3,000 acres. And in 2022, I surveyed 96 wetlands across both properties. And in 2023, I surveyed 97 wetlands across both properties. And in our first year, we allocated survey points based on the proportion of wetland types present on the properties. For example, there was a large majority of freshwater forested and shrub wetlands, so we surveyed the most of those in the first year. And in our second year in 2023, We reallocated survey point proportions to focus more on the most productive wetland type from the previous year. And spoiler alert, it was estuarine wetlands, so we surveyed more of those in the second year. So how did we go about forming this baseline? We executed several types of surveys, including point count surveys, secretive marsh bird playback surveys, macroinvertebrate surveys, vegetation surveys, as well as monthly wetland level data. And with the interest of time, I'm not going to go into detail about each of these, but I would be happy to answer any questions later. All right, getting into some results. So this is the total number of species we detected over both years. Many of these species overlapped from year to year, but we had several added to the list in 2023 for a total of 56 species over both years. And like I mentioned before, one of our main objectives was to document migration patterns. So after averaging our 2 years of data using 2-week periods over our field seasons and species density in each individual wetland, this is what we found. We formed similar graphs for every species guild, as you can see here, and for every 56 species that we detected. We've got wading birds, shorebirds, waterfowl, secretive marsh birds, pelicans, aningas, and cormorants, gulls and terns, and grebes. But for the purpose of today, let's focus on the ducks. So as to no one's surprise, they were here throughout the winter and early spring, but steeply decreased as we reached the summer months. And we speculate that they're using these properties as stopover sites along their migration route to gain energy, build lipid reserves, and obtain protein for sustaining migration from seeds, other plant material, and invertebrates. And I'd like to also point out that their density was very low across these sites. And since these sites aren't specifically managed for waterfowl, we did not observe many in the study area, even though they were abundant in numerous managed wetlands within the 20 kilometers of the site. And this draws back to the relative distribution of plant and invertebrate foods varying across foraging habitats, and a more intense management plan is needed to increase their presence. And just for your viewing pleasure, I did want to mention that we separated the results from year to year, but chose to focus on the averages. This was because our field season had a late start in the first year, as I was just getting my ducks in a row, and we did not want that to affect any conclusions we were drawing. Now looking into each waterfowl species specifically, again in very low densities, but they were here nonetheless. Starting with wood ducks and black-bellied whistling ducks. So wood ducks are year-round residents of South Carolina and were observed throughout our field season on these properties. And McCall does have artificial nesting boxes, but as to my knowledge, they're not at all maintained, so do not to be seen in use. And I mostly observed wood ducks at the ponds at Debadew and a few at the pond over by the McCall house. And as for black-bellied whistling ducks, I only saw them on one occasion, but I thought it was cool to include. I believe it was just 4 individuals, and so I think they were just passing through, but it was very exciting when I got to see them. Also, please disregard the letters on each graph. I regrouped them into diving versus dabbling versus neither, so that's not going to make sense. But onto our dabblers. We saw mottled ducks, American widgeon, blue-winged teal, mallards, green-winged teal, and gadwall. And you can see that they all had similar patterns, stopping over at our field sites around March. I mostly saw these guys on shallow ponds at Debadew, an occasional emergent intertidal wetland, and on the lakes at Debadew. And you can see that mottled ducks and American widgeon had the highest densities. I saw these in very large numbers on the lakes for several weeks, and that was quite a pleasure. As far as diving ducks go, we saw hooded mergansers, bufflehead, red-breasted mergansers, ruddy duck, and common mergansers. They had similar patterns as well. They were largely detected in several deep water wetlands, a large pond in Debadew, and several lakes. The ruddy duck was also a one-time sighting on a lake in Devido, but that was definitely a highlight of the field season. And just to reiterate, these data exist for all species guilds and individual species, but I did not go into all of those today, but I would be happy to show those to anybody who's interested. And so to further solidify our findings, using species densities in 2-week periods, we performed a hierarchical cluster analysis to identify which species had similar migration patterns and which species were in the area at the same time. We used the complete linkage clustering that joins clusters by measuring the maximum distance between 2 points. And as the hierarchy increases, the distance between points decreases. In other words, as clusters get closer together, these species were found at similar times. So you can see that the analysis identified 2 large clusters. Cluster A more frequently occurred from April to July, while species found in cluster B more frequently occurred from January to March. And those included almost all waterfowl species. And cluster B was then divided into 2 subclusters, subcluster 2 being where most waterfowl occurred, and that was the beginning of the January to March period. All right, so now getting a little bit into chapter 2's analysis, we ran a generalized linear mix model with a Poisson distribution to identify which of our environmental factors were attracting waterbirds to these areas. And we ran this model for every species guild again, and with the interest of saving time, we just did this for our top 12 detected species. And for the purposes of today, these are the results for our waterfowl guild. And it showed significance for location, wetland classification, vegetation distribution pattern, water regime, wind direction, distance to nearest wetland, wetland area, macroinvertebrate species richness, and percent veg cover. And looking into some of these significant variables, we ran a least squared means test for all categorical variables. It showed that Devido was significantly different than Hopcall, which just based off of memory of the field seasons, that is accurate. And to test, the test of wetland classification showed that the lacustrine, limnetic, unconsolidated bottom wetlands were significantly different. And those were our lakes at Devido that hosted the most ducks, which is, again, not a surprise. For vegetation distribution pattern, this was based off of Stewart and Cantrud's illustration. Cover type 4 was the most significant. And on the right is that illustration of the patterns, and the white area indicates open water and the black indicates emergent vegetation. So this bottom cover type was the most significant. And tests for water regime revealed that permanently flooded wetlands were significantly different. All of these factors overlap, as you can see. And so I'm still in the process of exploring these numerical variables, but just to reiterate, those were distance to nearest wetland, wetland area, macroinvertebrate species richness, and percent vegetation cover. And these results so far are aligning with my previous predictions from last year from results of Balcom et al. And Clip et al. So getting into overall conclusions, there are a few things worth noting. Our study identified a very low overall density for most species, which could have been due to weather during our field season, such as lack of rainfall, or just low habitat quality. And when Hurricane Hugo hit back in 1989, it caused a decline in the total number of vegetation species present here, with Phragmites rapidly colonizing these areas. And even further declines occurred between 2013 and 2015, likely due to rising sea levels and increase in water salinity. And this, of course, leads us to a recommendation of an intense management protocol to mitigate Phragmites invasion, hopefully drawing more waterbirds to the area. But we all know that is much easier said than done. And lastly, we intend for these data to inform surrounding and future managers on how and when to manipulate these wetlands to attract more waterbirds to the area. We like to see more managed wetlands on Hopcall in general to bring more waterfowl in. And I've seen several rice trunks in the wetlands here, but definitely they're out of commission and in pretty rough shape. And for example, if we could get those trunks functioning and even add additional trunks to our wetlands, we could draw in water from November through February for waterfowl and draw back water starting in March for shorebirds. Going forward, we intend for this to be at the beginning of a long-term data set and to have more students studying this area. And like I said earlier, this serves as just a baseline of wetland data, and we love to continue monitoring waterbirds populations here and on surrounding properties. Additionally, many of our species densities fluctuated, likely due to the varying time of day in which we surveyed and the tide level at that time. And nearly 45% of our wetlands were tidally influenced, so some of our variability could potentially be explained by tide level rather than time of year. And we love to perform future surveys during high or low tide only to standardize these conditions. Of course, this then does cause problems with missing those species that utilize the opposite tide level. And we also chose to perform ground surveys using an ATV since this was the most accessible at the time. So we were only able to record species as far as the eye can see. And additional data could be obtained through the use of aerial plane surveys, a drone, or even telemetry. And so I'm really excited to see more of Oxy's results and compare those to what I found. So I have lots of people to thank: the Kennedy Center, Dr. Anderson, the Devido Colony, Nemours, the Baruch Foundation, Pate Foundation, and our college at Clemson. And I had lots of help during the summers from my 4 undergraduate interns, and of course year-round from my husband, who sacrificed many weekends to help me do these surveys. And I will take any questions. Yes.
Why were there no research during the fall?
Oh gosh. We just started in January to, we started January through July, and we just didn't have the time or resources to start earlier. It would be interesting to see starting in November.
Not really a question, just an observation. I think you can really make the case as far as the wetlands here in Oklahoma, that they are, look like they're very important for our breeding, residential ducks, split ducks, and black-bellied whistling ducks.
Yeah.
Not so much, wintering water fowl.
Right.
There's a good case to be made there. You also mentioned, Jordan, that most of the ducks you did see were on the lakes at Devido.
Yes.
Did you notice any SAB growing in those lakes?
Yes, we did. I had some of my interns actually did see like widgeon grass there, so that was interesting. Yeah.
That's what I thought, but that's interesting too.
Yeah.
I guess back to Alexis' earlier presentation, the importance of SAB communities.
Yeah, I would love to be able to do more macroinvertebrate stuff out there specifically, because we were only able to take samples once during the survey period. I think it would be really interesting to see the macroinvertebrate communities month to month, see how that's affecting the population. Yes, Castles.
Going off of what Don said, it would be interesting to see what these ducks are utilizing, because these are on 2 properties that are not hunted.
Correct, yeah.
All the properties around it are hunted. So is there a big influx of waterfowl into these areas after the start of hunting season, which would go off of Nick Maston's research with mallards in Tennessee, showing that basically the birds are dispersed on all these other plantations and properties managed for waterfowl, but as hunting season starts, they congregate on areas that don't have any pressure.
Yeah.
That'd be interesting.
Sort of like sanctuary.
Right.
Yeah.
Are they using this more as a sanctuary, or Devido salt pond as a sanctuary to get away from pressure?
Yeah.
More so than like actual wintering ground.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. I would definitely be inclined to look at that.
But you don't have to go back to it, but on your shorebird slide, what did I see? The peak was April. Is that?
We can go back and look. I think so.
There was research done here around Georgetown back in the early 80s that showed the peaks were the second week of May. But we've been looking at some things recently that looks like that has moved back to like the third week in April.
Mhm.
And it seems to be a trend where as temperature changes, birds are migrating earlier through. So it's
Yes.
the shore shows almost the same thing.
Yes, that is very interesting. Yeah, these are some of the peaks I was talking about with the tide levels as well. So that's why we've got two there.
The second week of May used to be peak back in 81, 82, 83.
Oh, very interesting. Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Anybody else?